Hi. Hi, I'm Zach. It's very nice to meet all of you. Before I get started, just a quick, can we please thank the Ludza team for working nights and weekends for putting this thing on? This is incredible. ContainerDays is already off to a really strong start. We had some awesome keynotes. And side note, Ludza is just an awesome company. I've had the opportunity to work with a lot of them closely, and they're definitely worth your business. So you came to this talk, so if this was not what you were expecting, food is at the back and you can leave. And the next section I timed takes 30 seconds, so you can check Instagram for the next 30 seconds. This is the commercial for my company, which is Ygrene. It is the word energy spelled backwards. I didn't know that until 6 months into my own job. And what we do is we sell money, primarily in the United States. We do renewable energy financing. So basically, the TLDR is if you want to put a solar panel on your house, you can pay it back through your property taxes, which is pretty nice because it means that we can do a lot of really cool stuff. There are metrics on the amount of impact that we've had, but the University of Southern California did a study, and in the 8 years that Ygrene's been in business and the $1.5 billion that we've originated, we've actually been able to quantifiably reverse climate change in the areas, which is very exciting for us. And that, from a finance company, I think is very exciting. But you guys didn't come to do finance, you came to do security stuff. So that's what we're going to talk about here. So what is this talk? What I would hope that you get out of this is slightly a case study on what happened at Ygrene, but if I do this right, hopefully you'll walk away here with actually practical steps for your own companies to improve your security stance in the cloud-native space. This talk assumes familiarity with Docker and Kubernetes, so if you don't already have that, it will probably be a little bit confusing at times. It does not assume that you are an expert in security. I'm not, we're all learning, but this is where we're at right now. We set up our own little mental framework for how we think about security at Ygrene, and we've been able in the last year to actually get this into the Kubernetes official documentation, which is how we think about cloud-native security. We think about it at 4 different levels. They all start with the letter C, so that fits in my mind. It starts with the cloud, moves into the cluster, then the container, and then the application source code. And if you go to, don't want to get the microphone feedback. If you go to that link, you will be able to find a far more in-depth explanation and many links to jump off and do more things in Kubernetes related to security. So with that, we'll get started. How's everybody doing? I rely on feedback from the crowd, so if I see like deadpan, it's going to be tough. Okay, so first up, unfortunately, my colleague was not able to join me for this talk. He normally does this section, so I'm going to do my very best to represent him well, but we'll see how it goes. So code and containers, we'll start at the smallest level of security abstraction and move outwards. So obviously the application that is running inside of your cluster was written in source code, I hope, and eventually turned into a container. And that's how you get into Kubernetes. We're personally focused on Docker, but there are obviously many different containerization engines that work in Kubernetes. Containers are really great, and they solve a lot of problems in dev, but they actually introduce a lot in production. And that's actually why we have Kubernetes, is because of the orchestration problems, configuration management, and a lot of the other things that have happened to be able to orchestrate many microservices and many containers. So because we're a finance company, we think about risk management in finance and in security. So risk management with Docker, what we care about is unexpected container contents running in production, data leakage into the container, and operating system and application level vulnerabilities. These things are all things we've encountered in production that have really messed things up. The unexpected container contents is always a really fun one to discover later on in a root cause analysis. But generally, what you are trying to avoid in a Docker container is treating it like a server, which we still have problems with. We still think of them as Linux servers. So jumping in and trying to run curl commands or apt-get or doing something to be able to diagnose inside of a pod or inside of a container can actually lead to many risks that are associated with security. So An example of a few of the other ones are base images that have been updated since the last time we pulled latest. So if in a build pipeline, let's say you build from Ruby 2.4 latest, and something got pushed to the Docker global repo, and now it breaks your application, or it changes it in some way that you can't see until the code actually executes. These become risks when you're running in production, and especially become security risks if you have no control over them. We've also seen places where private keys or AWS credentials are put inside of containers so that you can do things more effectively, which is great if you need to include private dependencies like NPM dependencies that are private, or like Ruby gems that are private, or AWS resources that are also private. But committing something like that in plain text in either a Docker file or into a Git repo presents a very serious security concern, because that person, if they're able to compromise Git, we saw this happen with Uber last year, is able to use those AWS credentials to do far worse things. So the mitigation is we actually decide to solve this in the build pipeline and how we look at Docker containers. Gotta face forward. So we have a couple of different policies: Dockerfile policies, CVE policies, and identity policies. And all of these are codified inside of the our pipeline. We personally use Atlassian's Bamboo to build. These work with anything. They're simple bash commands. But we basically have a base image policy which restricts you from using the latest tag and ensures that we're using the Center for Information Security, the CIS benchmark for Dockerfile best practices. There is a tool called HatOlint, we'll see it in just a bit, that allows you to do exactly that. In an application CVE policy, we basically check to see that there are no code dependencies that are obviously broken, doing a static analysis, eventually doing a live penetration test inside. It's sort of a continuous hacking type approach, and then do Linux and operating system dependency checking. Finally, the identity policy, which is more like secure signing and image provenance. Did anybody go to the container security workshop yesterday? Cool, this may be repeat for you guys. So the how to use Notary securely and base image identity verification and signing process is all automated for us inside of our pipeline. And that way we basically guarantee that the image comes from us, has the exact contents that we're looking for, and that we're not shipping an obvious vulnerability into production. And I think that that's our goal. We're not going to be able to prevent zero-day vulnerabilities, and we're not trying to in a build pipeline. But what we are trying to prevent is shipping a vulnerability that could have otherwise been stopped at some point throughout the build process. So what this looks like for us is exactly this, but this in bash. So the Dockerfile policy runs and checks and lints everything. We look through all of the Docker standards and some of our own internal tools. As we said here, essentially a from policy, checking to make sure that we don't run as root, dependency and package checksums, and removing privileged binaries. So anything like that requires GID access with the root user or some other binary that allows you to escalate privileges, that would not be allowed inside of a container. I think one of the biggest things for us is to not use the latest tag. This has gotten us into trouble a lot of times, because the latest tag always includes whatever the exact latest build was inside of Docker. It's a globally recognized tag, but that doesn't always necessarily mean that that's the tag that you really wanted to have running in your particular environment. So wherever possible, don't use latest. Okay. After that, we do our application dependency check. So the application dependency check is just to leverage community work to weed out clear security problems. There is a tool for Ruby, which is called Brakeman, and then also Bundle Audit. These tools exist. The Open Web Application Security group has actually published a list for every language and generally every framework that allows you to use, so Go has one, Java has one, and many other languages and frameworks have them. But for us, it's to statically check our code to make sure that there's no places where there could be a possible SQL injection attack vulnerability, or places where in our application dependency scanning that there wasn't a recent CVE filed at a particular CVSS score, which, if you don't know what that means, is basically the severity of the CVE of 6.0 or higher. meaning that something would be clearly very, very bad. And that's essentially the high level to the very highest. So preventing obvious issues in production from shipping. Then we actually build the container, and this is where we invoke Docker Content Trust. If you have not heard of Docker Content Trust or Notary, this should definitely be on your list of things to do. Notary provides an extraordinarily simple way, and Docker Content Trust actually integrates it into the Docker CLI. So you get it for free if you just run with one flag on inside of Docker to be able to actually sign and enforce the signing of pulled images. So when I say image signing, the way that Notary handles all of the metadata of a container is it uses a system of keys. And there's a talk later on today that I think goes into this. But the system of keys allows an owner to be an administrator of an entire organization, a target, a snapshot, and a timestamp. Don't worry about remembering all of that. The TLDR is essentially you can make sure that you're guaranteed to be using the correct repo, the right revision, the right contents, and the most up-to-date version. And that's really important because it's cryptographically verifiable. Not like blockchain sense, like cryptographically like the Shaw's match. And the signature came from a key that actually signed the contents of the metadata. This is all enforced for you just by using that flag in Docker Content Trust. So then building the image, signing the metadata, and then squashing to get rid of any secret keys that might be needed for the build but shouldn't be in the runtime. Docker squash, I think, might still be an experimental feature. You can enable it in the, I see a nod, perfect. Yes, it is still an experimental feature. You can enable it in the daemon.json file inside of the Docker machine. Okay, so the next thing we do is we actually use the Z-attack proxy from the Open Web Application Security Group. The Z-attack proxy will actually run the top 10 most common vulnerability scenarios against your application. So it will try SQL injection attacks. It will try cross-site scripting requests, CSRF, other different types of things that are quite obvious. It will actually try to hack your container, so to speak. So this step usually takes about 10 minutes, and it'll run through the entire API, ensuring that in a live-style environment that we didn't ship a vulnerability that was obvious and that we could have prevented. The Z-attack proxy is actually quite nice. There are links right here to be able to get after it. And then the next thing we do is actually check the image itself for vulnerabilities. This involves using CoreOS's Clair product. I don't know if you guys have heard of Clair. It's an open source project, quite fantastic. You get it for free if you use the key.io registry. And I think it's actually a great tool. It can help you do vulnerability analysis of the contents of your containers. And that actually is really nice because it can prevent you from progressing forward in your build step from, again, shipping an obvious vulnerability. You guys are probably starting to hear a broken record up here about shipping obvious vulnerabilities, but I can't tell you how pertinent that is. As, I think Equifax had an obvious vulnerability that one time. So the final one is signing and pushing, and this is where we actually do the pushing of the metadata. Right. But a signed image is not good enough because it can't be enforced. And so in order to enforce images, there's kind of a blanket statement you can apply for the entire Docker daemon running inside of a machine. But there are actually some containers which aren't signed that you may want to run inside of Kubernetes. Docker Content Trust isn't universally accepted yet, meaning that it's not universally deployed. So there are people and scenarios that don't actually have it. And because of that, instead of running your Docker daemon inside of Kubernetes with Docker Content Trust, we actually use a tool called Portieris from IBM. Portieris is Greek for the word gatekeeper, so more nautical themes and terms. It is a great tool. It works as a mutating admission webhook controller, which is fancy pants words for when you submit a request to the Kubernetes API, it will actually check the signed metadata from the endpoint and ensure that it conforms to a policy that you've specified. And if it does, it will actually replace the container image container image tag with the SHA-256 hash of that particular signed metadata so that you know that you're always getting the correct image. And that's actually a nice way of being able to get around the fact that you can't necessarily turn on Docker Content Trust universally inside of a Kubernetes cluster. which I think would definitely also warrant investigation. How's everybody doing? Good? Cool. Coffee's almost here. So I think that wraps up the... Oh, no, we're going to talk a little bit about Notary. Sorry, his slides. Okay. Oh, this is a way better way of explaining Notary. This is perfect. We can actually dive into this. Okay, so remember when I talked about all of those keys? Well, this is a good diagram. So we have root keys and target keys. A root key is essentially bound to the, if you think about it, if you have a namespace like docker.io/company name, a root key would be the key that's responsible for signing every image inside of that sub-repository group. So key.io/Ygrene has a root key that is bound to it that we have and kept offline because it's responsible for being able to revoke or rotate all of the rest of these keys which do actually get signed. The target keys are specific to repos. So key.io/Ygrene/microservice A would have its own target key, which is responsible for signing all updates to that particular repository. And that's important because that one can also be kept offline as well. And the way that we can do this is through delegation keys and roles. A delegation just means essentially I've created a new key and an associated certificate, and I have delegated the permissions to sign images in this repo to this delegate key. And the way that that works is a little bit more complicated, and you can check it out. The specification is in the update framework, TUF, which is a CNCF project, and it goes into a very good explanation of how that exact process works. Notary does a great job of enforcing this, so we can just rely on the command line interface of Notary, which is nice. So what we do in our particular build server and pipeline environment is we have a delegate key for our server. That way we don't have to keep our targets keys online inside of the server. You can imagine a compromise of our CI/CD pipeline would basically allow somebody to sign any image on behalf of Ygrene as a legal Ygrene image, and then that could be used in our own cluster to probably to our downfall, which would not be good. So to prevent this, we actually have a delegation where upon creation of a new microservice, we delegate the permission to build that microservice to a Bamboo specific key which gets rotated daily. And we basically guarantee through the certificate created date and valid to date that it can be used for no more than 48 hours. So if the server becomes compromised, somebody could only build a legally signed image on behalf of Ygrene for up to 48 hours, which I think is probably about the best way that we can control delegation, expiration, and timelines. There is a proposal in the update framework. It is called TAP 8, and you can check it out. That is how a possible better way to do role revocation. So when we use the delegate key to sign the latest version of that code with the particular container contents, with the SHA, and push it, it gets accepted by the server because it is a legally valid key and it's been delegated to. And then all of that is persisted in the Notary server client inside of key.io or docker.io. Most container registries should have a Notary service running already for it. The last time I checked, Amazon ECR was the only one that did not. So if you use that, you may run into problems trying to do Notary. It actually forced us to move off of ECR into key.io. So if you use that, keep in mind. I have no idea if Harbor does. Right. So if Harbor does, then terrific. You can run a Notary server. OK, on to the part that maybe the rest of us were here for. So now that we've gotten our code and our containers locked down, we can actually move on to running them in our cluster and then securing the cloud environment around it so that all of the resources provisioned in the cluster and by the cluster are themselves secure. So what I like to say is like issues in Kubernetes for the risk averse. As a cluster operator, what you have to realize is that the locus of control of you as someone who runs software has been effectively delegated to a benevolent botnet. And I say benevolent botnet because like the Kubernetes masters are command and control servers, and the kubelet running on nodes are themselves the zombie servers running the processes that whatever the master tells them to. And I think that the fact that it is a benevolent botnet means there's a serious amount of power that someone can wield by compromising the Kubernetes API server or by being able to mutate the responses of a kubelet back to the API server. So it is also open source software. So I ran a scan of the internet recently, and I found about 14,000 clusters in the IPv4 address space, which are completely open and unauthenticated, and are available to use by anybody. I forget the link that I had for it, but it was very, very sad and depressing because theoretically, if you needed spare compute power to go mine Bitcoin, you could just go use those because it would work with the Kubernetes API. And because it's open source software, there is no universally guaranteed way to deploy Kubernetes, which means there's a way to do it wrong. And I think those of us who have had, actually, a quick show of hands, has anyone tried to do Kubernetes by themselves, like without a cluster provisioning tool? Okay, so a few brave people in the crowd. Very nice. It's easy to get wrong. When you look, and the API server requires about 5 minutes worth of scrolling to get all of the flags to make sure that you have the correct ones, you kind of realize you're running inside of a tool in an ecosystem that requires a lot of configuration and requires a lot of attention to be able to get right. And I think your attack surface essentially doubles with Kubernetes. If you think about it, before in traditional environments, our concern was generally only related to servers. We had to make sure that our AppArmor profiles were correct. We had to make sure that our, if we were using SC Linux, that our mandatory access controls were configured correctly. And that was basically it. As long as we had like some form of network scanning, like a tool like Barracuda, we could get an effective rebuff against most attacks that would come our way. But Kubernetes doubles this attack surface because we've just added containers. So the nodes themselves have to be secure. The containers themselves have to be secure. And both of them run Linux in different flavors and with different permissions. Seeing the list of CVEs that have been filed against Kubernetes in the last year alone should demonstrate the fact that it's actually quite easy to get wrong, even for the people who built the tool. I think the scariest one was the privilege escalation vulnerability that existed inside of the Docker daemon, which didn't affect Kubernetes specifically, except that pretty much every cluster that runs Kubernetes uses Docker as its virtualization, I suppose, engine, the container runtime engine for the cluster. Which means that if a container was running as root and they managed to escape the privilege boundary, then they had root permissions on the node, which has, I assume, unfettered access to the network, depending on how you configured the node. It's a very scary and sobering reality, but it just means that we have to pay a lot more attention to how we've configured Kubernetes. So improper cluster bootstrap setup will cause security holes. And then, unfortunately, there is no current existing body responsible for determining regulatory compliance. I think the CNCF has recently started, as in within the last year, something called SIG Security. And if it's an interest of yours, the meetings are Wednesdays at 10 a.m. Pacific time. And you can find all of that information in GitHub and sign up. So I would say that there is a concerted effort to move towards a regulatory body determining the compliance of Kubernetes. But it's just getting started, and Kubernetes has about 6 years worth of steam ahead of it, so there's a lot of catching up to do. Okay, so now that we've talked about these issues, let's talk about tools to mitigate risks. So Kubernetes list of 1,000 API server flags and feature gates. Let's talk about a few that can specifically help us with mitigating security risks. A lot of these have to do with scheduling, and some of them have to do with specific security principles that exist inside of Kubernetes. The number one that you should probably be using if you're not, and if you're using it, you may want to check to make sure that you're doing it right, is role-based access control in Kubernetes. Kubernetes has had a few different ways of doing permissioning inside of the cluster, and there's still no one terrific way to do identity management in Kubernetes. But at least for authorizing API requests, there has been a standardization on role-based access control. Role-based access control allows you as a cluster operator to really lock down and control the service accounts that interact with the Kubernetes API, so things that programmatically access Kubernetes inside of Kubernetes, or the users themselves that are accessing Kubernetes on your behalf. If you're using a cluster lifecycle management tool like Kubernetes, or EKS or GKE, generally those cloud providers will have tools that allow you to map users existing in an IAM, an IAM setting to roles inside of Kubernetes. And those are extremely helpful at being able to control access to your cluster. The one caveat to that is the fact that generally the easiest attack vector would be your CI/CD pipeline, because generally your CI/CD pipeline has the most permissions to be able to do the most things in your cluster, because you want to be able to allow it to perform whatever tasks necessary to deploy your code. I don't have great recommendations there, except for very frequent credential rotation. More tools. So API server, validation, and mutating admission controllers. There's a really cool way that Kubernetes allows requests inside of the cluster. It goes through a 3-stage process. The first stage is authentication, who are you? The second step was authorization, which is taken care of by RBAC, which is can you do what you just said you could? And the third one is can I investigate the object and does it conform to any existing policies that are inside of the cluster? And this is actually really cool because it can extend any existing policies that you might have as a company. For example, if you have a policy as a company that nothing can run in privileged mode inside of Docker, then you can actually enforce that as a validating admission controller, and Kubernetes will reject any requests that has a YAML manifest which is trying to use a privileged Docker runtime. It's quite nice. The documentation for that can be found on kubernetes.io, and all of the feature gates and flags required to set that up, I think by now is actually quite standard and on, because it's stable. Network security policies. Depending on the container network interface that you use, things like Calico, I don't remember all of them, actually have native support for network policies. And network policies are essentially like security groups, but inside of Kubernetes, controlling service-to-service access or pod-to-pod access on a label-based selection, which is nice because Kubernetes still has that nice label-based selection process, and then on particular ports. So if front-end A is only allowed to talk to microservice C, it should never be talking to microservice B, then that can actually be expressed inside of a network policy manifest and enforced by Kubernetes. And it will actively reject any requests at the container network interface layer. So it's not going to send requests to the API server and drown it in trying to see whether or not it can run network requests. You would have to check to make sure that your container network interface actually supports this. I don't have an exhaustive list, and all of that can be found in the Kubernetes documentation. Pod security policies are quite an excellent way to express more tersely, I think, the runtime requirements of a particular pod. A pod security policy can define things like AppArmor policies on your behalf. And when the scheduler binds a pod to a node, it can enforce that specific AppArmor policy when it's actually being run on that particular node. Pod security policies are stable as of this most recent release, and I believe more documentation to find on kubernetes.io. I don't have great suggestions for them, except use them. They're quite straightforward and easy. The final one is taints and tolerations. Taints and tolerations are a way of using advanced scheduling in Kubernetes. Advanced scheduling just means more than using the default scheduler to put pods wherever they fit in the cluster. So by using taints and tolerations, you can essentially say this node is only allowed to run things which I deem to be ultra secure. So these can be things like our financial data service, or things like the social security encryptor, or other sorts of tools that you would only want running on that particular node. They can actually be bound to that particular node and rejected away from other nodes so that insecure apps aren't being scheduled on the same physical node as ones that are more secure. This can help with enforcing things like PCI compliance, but it can also help to think about your topology and saying, maybe my PHP-based WordPress app shouldn't be on the exact same node as our financial data service because WordPress gets hacked like every second, and I don't want my financial data service to be the result of that. There are some external tools to help mitigate these risks. I would recommend looking into them. Aquascanner's QBench project is quite amazing. They have done some really great work. They give you a benchmark score on how your cluster is doing with respect to setting up the appropriate API server flags and using the actual policies. Heptio's AWS Authenticator allows you to use AWS IAM to authenticate inside of your cluster. This only matters if you're not using EKS. If you're using EKS, it's already baked in. And service mesh tools like Istio and Linkerd and others. Service meshes will be talked about, I imagine, by plenty of other people at this conference. Suffice it to say, it's really great if you can have a network service that can enforce TLS connections in between all of your services, and you don't have to worry about the infrastructure of setting up, of managing your own cert authority, or actually provisioning the certificates for your services themselves. I think all of that sort of goes to show you is where you can use a managed service, because a lot of these people are paid hefty sums of money to be correct about security. And they have to think about a lot of customers, not just individual ones. And most of the other vendors in the showcase, I assume, also have security-focused solutions, so check them out. But if you can't use a managed service, then use a tool like COPS. COPS has been really terrific for Ygrene. We use that in production. It allows us to get versioning. We can use Terraform. It actually will generate Terraform, so we can validate before we run every single cluster update. It will manage the cluster lifecycle, which means we can do a rolling update. We actually, during the CVE upgrade, did a rolling update during the day, and it worked with no downtime, which was magical. But it does mean that you're sort of on your own for issue diagnosis and that you have a higher management overhead. Okay, thank you for paying attention. Kubernetes is good for Ygrene. Ygrene's great for the planet, and I hope you guys have a good day. Do we have time for questions? Are there any questions really quickly? And if I didn't address your particular concern, you can also talk to me. I have 3 minutes for questions. So if you want to stand up, shout it out. Otherwise, I'll be standing over here. Yes?
You have some intrusion detection tools?
Yes, we do have intrusion detection tools. We use, because we run in AWS, we use AWS GuardDuty, which does a lot of the intrusion detection using Amazon's own internal machine learning. And since Amazon defends the internet from the internet, I figure they've got a pretty good advanced tuned set of machine learning models to detect particular types of intrusions. Does that help answer your question? Yeah, we use a managed service for that. But I think an open source tool like Snort might also work. That's a cool microphone. You could throw that. All right, I take it silence as everyone's ready for coffee. Thank you guys so much. I hope you have a great day.